So my name is Tim Reber with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I'm a primary lead for our technical assistance mini-grid work in partnership with USAID and the government of Haiti with EnergyCell and NRSA. I see a lot of familiar names on here. I think probably many of you know me already, so glad you could all join us. Again, just for those who did join late, apologies for getting started a little bit late here. Our EnergyCell colleagues messaged just a few minutes.
De t'avoir commencé aussi tard. Nos collègues à Énergie sont un petit peu en retard. Ils ne peuvent pas nous rejoindre encore. Ils sont en retard pour le moment. Mais on pourra commencer sans eux. Donc, comme on n'a pas EnergyCell avec nous pour le moment, qui pourrait nous donner des points importants, donc on a Eric ici qui pourra partager quelques informations avec nous. Merci, Tim. Quelques points. C'est un partenariat entre USAID et la National Laboratory. Ils étaient impressionnés par nos capacités à travers les années. Ils voulaient ajouter de la valeur avant ça. Et nous sommes contents et on apprécie que vous avez pu prendre l'opportunité de travailler avec nous.
Are so focused on providing access to electricity to the population of Haiti. And
et
so,
nous sommes aussi contents dans le deuxième point que le NRCA est content de donner l'électricité dans des départements éloignés de Haïti. Donc, c'est juste pour assister le gouvernement haïtien en donnant un service de transparence et qui va nous donner l'opportunité de donner un service.
And very complex too, given all the locations that are not available, that they don't have access to a national grid or to a regional grid.
Et le besoin d'électricité en Haïti est.
So, but nevertheless, you have to be very careful how you invest. And so the proper regulatory framework is really key to that. So I'm happy that Tim and the team were able to provide support to the Haitian government in that respect. So I'm going to be here off and on to the workshop. I have to go to a different meeting at noon, but I can come back later on for the discussion points later on. So I wish you guys a very good workshop.
Un peu plus tard, je suis content qu'on pourra donner aussi quelques points et on pourra discuter un petit peu plus tard au cours de cette formation.
Eric, did we, or Tim, did we lose you?
Yeah, I don't see him on. His connection might have cut out again.
Well, you can hear my points?
Yes.
Opening or not? Could you guys
No, we could hear you. We could hear you.
Perfect. He's just not back yet. Okay, good. Thanks.
Yeah. Give him a second. As we go through this, just quickly remind folks that if you go down to the bottom of your screen in the toolbar, there is a translation and an international budget button, and you can hit that and choose either French or English. We have instantaneous translation for the session. So if you select French, you should be hearing everything in French. And if you English, obviously, when we're talking in English, there won't be translation. But if someone is talking in French, then it will be translated to English. So please select your button and then feel free to use the language that you are most comfortable with. So quickly about the agenda, clearly with the Energy Cell not able to join us, we'll probably move on with the regular agenda. Here, let me turn on my video so that you can see me. I'm Ian Berenguel from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And so our plan was to talk a little bit, start off with an example from Uganda, which us and actually TTA that's represented on the call and has been working in Haiti, did a fair amount of work with a new regulation in Uganda. So we'll do a quick overview of that. And then have a discussion about kind of regulatory frameworks in general. And then again, not largely, but partially based on the Uganda work and clearly the FAIRIS program, talk through some of the key facets in regards to kind of regulation specifics that, again, a lot of those are in the call that was released and the new one that's coming out. But there is a different step to have them in a kind of a solicitation process as compared to have them in a regulatory framework that has more kind of teeth behind it. And so talk through,
On pourra parler un petit peu des règlements, des points à soulever, la considération aussi.
That to get your feedback in which areas all of you think are the most important as we go forwards, and then have some good time for question and answers. So I see that Tim is back. So I'll hand it back over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Ian. Apologies. Because when it rains, it pours. Sorry. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. Got booted there. So it sounds like Ian was just running through a bit of the agenda and the plan for today. So I won't necessarily go back over all of this in terms of the agenda, but I did just want to hit on the objectives for today. So first and foremost, the goal for today is really to establish sort of a shared understanding, at least from our perspective, of what are some of the key questions and issues that go into an effective and fairly robust regulatory framework for mini grids. That's the number one piece here. And then secondarily, the goal of today is really to solicit input and feedback from all of you. So we're really pleased to have several of our government partners from NARCE, from the Ministry of Finance, from EDH, and hopefully soon from Energy Cell as well as several of our partners from the donor and development community as well. So as I heard Ian mentioning, right as I came back in, they'll be going through some of these key questions and also have a little bit of polling intended to collect some input from all of you. And then we do have some time for a bit of discussion, question, and feedback at the end there. So without any further ado, as it looks like colleagues from Energy Cell have not yet joined, they were going to kick us off with an overview of the sort of the current regulatory environment in Haiti. We're going to mix things up a little bit, and we'll go right into our second item, which will be a bit of a scene-setting case study, pulling from some of the work that we've done in Uganda, developing similar mini-grid regulatory frameworks, and then move on to reviewing some of the key considerations. And whenever Energy Cell is able to join, we'll just go ahead and plug them in and have them share some of the content that they've prepared. So mixing it up a little bit, but again, thanks for everybody's flexibility in sorting that out. So I guess without any further ado, I'll hand it back over to Ian.
Great. Let's see if I can share my screen. So please let me know if this works, Tim. Come on. Hopefully you're seeing the full screen.
Yep, we got it.
Great. So I'm going to give a quick kind of introduction to some work that a few of us did in Uganda. Do want to highlight at the top that this is in a little different format. This project was funded by Power Africa under USAID in collaboration with the National Association for Regulatory Utility Commissioners. So NARUC. So do want to call out their assistance in this work that, as you will see, Haiti is benefiting from. And then also want to make it clear that the original presentation was developed by Kaylee from the Cadmus Group, and I'm borrowing a fair amount of that because it's completely relevant to the work that we're doing here. Uganda has a need for kind of mini grid power systems and very similar to Haiti. So very low electrification rates with lots of households without energy services. They do have a very established grid network that serves the kind of the major communities within Uganda, which is mainly driven by hydro and some thermal. And then a fair amount of independent power producers. So that's a little bit different from the Haiti context. But in general, the kind of, not the model, not using Uganda as a model, but they're very similar kind of concerns and considerations that we have. Uganda had a very kind of developed regulatory structure. And so they have a regulatory agency, the Electricity Regulatory Authority, or ERA, that was established quite a few years ago and had developed a very strong kind of regulatory framework around the power sector.
Eux-mêmes, ils sont dans le système d'électricité depuis longtemps, donc ils génèrent de l'électricité aussi et font la
regulatory structure, as well as a utility structure that was, I don't want to say decentralized, but there are a bunch of different power utilities within Uganda, and so the regulatory structure is relatively well developed. And they did have a legal framework passed by their government, which kind of had a breakout of this 2 megawatt threshold, which said things under 2 megawatts could live under one regulatory environment, and the things above 2 megawatts would live under a kind of a more formal, higher level regulatory process. And it was very well defined that ERA had the regulatory authority over the microgrid space, or the mini grid space, but it had no policy specific to mini grids, which ended up being the challenge and was seen as a large hindrance to mini grid developers who wanted to come in and start deploying within the country. There was from the previous slide, there was a strong need for mini grids to meet rural electrification goals or overall energy electrification goals, but there was no regulatory framework, and the mini grid developers who were working in the space highlighted the lack of a regulatory framework as a key challenge to the development of the mini grid market sector. So they had spent a lot of time looking at mini grids. A couple of studies had identified a huge potential capacity for mini grids. They were expecting fairly large growth. And then the Rural Electrification Agency, another defined body under the government in Uganda, had already started working in very similar fashion to Haiti to develop a kind of a solicitation, a tender structure to apply in areas of Uganda that would help kind of streamline a process prior to the implementation of a regulatory framework. But it was clearly understood that you couldn't do tenders for everything. And so even though tenders worked well, especially if there were foreign donors that were providing money into the system, that to be able to get to this kind of large growth, these 8,500 units, that needed to happen outside of a tendering process. And so a regulatory framework that would allow a developer to identify a community, understand what they needed to do to be able to provide power to that community, have kind of certainty or risk reduction in regards to can they develop it, what the tariffs are going to be, if the grid arrives, what's going to happen. All of these questions that we'll get into a little bit later, but are very common to people in Haiti, that they needed this kind of a structure to be able to get to the electrification rates that they were looking at. And then in addition, the NRECA and RECA had worked with the Rural Electrification Agency to do kind of a strategic assessment of Haiti to understand, or sorry, of Uganda. I'm going to keep going back and forth, apologies, to Uganda to identify areas of the country where the grid was likely not going to extend in the near future. And so it highlighted areas of the country where mini grid power systems would make the most sense and should be targeted in early development pathways. All of which laid out the framework to allow us to go forwards. But the problem was that there was no really understanding, or the regulatory framework wasn't designed with mini grids in mind, or even isolated grid supply. And there's this 2 megawatt threshold that was there in code, but how do you apply that into a 10 kilowatt or 100 kilowatt power system? Because that's not the way the original laws were defined. So we did look at this kind of categorization of above or below this 2 megawatt threshold that would allow the country to develop regulatory frameworks that didn't kind of hinder what was happening in the larger scale. If you wanted to put in a diesel engine and sell power to the grid, or a PV array or something of that nature, we didn't want to get in the way of that, but we didn't want this kind of larger regulatory structure to get in the way of the deployment of mini grids to the extent that we could. Understanding that ERA had legal requirements to do what they were doing as stated in law. So they had to put in a framework that fit within the legal construct of Uganda, which again is something that we'll have to address in Haiti as well. They did this kind of licensing and appeal process did allow this kind of difference between a licensing, which was for above 2 megawatts, and then what they called a license exemption for below 2 megawatts, even though you still had to get a license, but it was a different flavor of license with a slightly streamlined process. Again, a lot of this was codified in the law, and so the challenge of developing a mini grid regulatory structure was how you fit this in. And that's what we were called to do, to come in and address these kind of key questions that were never envisioned within the higher level regulatory structure. And so that was the challenge that that USAID and NARUC posed to a group of us that was led by the CADMIS group, which is out of Boston, Massachusetts, here in the United States. TTA, which is very engaged in the Haiti context, which is fabulous because they bring a huge wealth of expertise in a regulatory framework, both in the case of Uganda, but in Haiti and around the world primarily, but Africa and primarily, and then the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to help develop this regulatory framework for Uganda. We kind of started off with an assessment of regulatory frameworks in Africa, looking primarily at Tanzania, Kenya, Nigeria, to understand what other countries were doing, and then implemented basically a 12-month effort working with ERA to finalize a regulatory framework, which included, and I think this is really critical to think about, a number of series.
Il y avait eu beaucoup de segments de formation. Là, on a dû s'asseoir avec toute l'équipe. Et puis, il y avait aussi des investisseurs et il y a eu des...
Here, but the developers, the NGOs, the utilities, the donor organizations, to make sure that everybody provided excellent comments into the process so that the resulting effort would fit the kind of varied needs of the organizations while still being under the regulatory framework that ERA required. It also included two kind of sets of public comments on draft versions of the documents. The document was completed in December of last year and is going through the final stages of the governmental approval process approval from the Justice Ministry and the other line ministries, and should be codified quite soon, but that's a whole additional process that we'll talk a little bit about, but wasn't the meat of the efforts. Here's just kind of some examples of what we saw in other countries, Nigeria and Tanzania, in regards to breakouts and regulatory structures. Tanzania, as an example, if you're below 100 kilowatts, there is really no regulatory structure. You just simply register your power system. I'm this company and I'm installing a system in this community, and that's all you need to do. All the way up to Nigeria, that has a kind of a more defined registration permit process with different exclusivities and definitions of technical standards. And in the Uganda case, we broke it up into kind of 3 areas that align quite well with what's happening in Haiti, and then we'll follow through with some of these other discussions. But kind of preliminary, how it applies, the application of the structure, the kind of the regulatory, the registration certificates and mandatory conditions. They get into a lot of the more process steps about what limits are acceptable below 2 megawatts, what types of systems are required. A whole section on technical frameworks for design, safety, metering, internal electrical connections, quality of service and reliability. A whole section on tariffs that define the tariff structure, how often they can be updated, whether there are automatic ratcheting of tariffs, all of these things that help the developer get a good assurance that that their investment will be able to kind of be addressed, and the tariff will come to agreement. A whole interconnection and to the grid and how one goes about addressing those, reporting, some miscellaneous things, and then a whole bunch of forms and schedules. So we'll touch on all of these. Again, what TDA has done with Energy Cell in regards to the solicitations follow a lot of the same logic. And so you'll see that as we go through some of the details, a lot of the kind of the conditions and the considerations that we introduce here, there's already a really strong framework. The difference being that in the current framework, they're under a request for proposal process. And what we would like to get to eventually is a regulatory process, so that any company that can fit the regulatory requirements can propose a grid someplace, mini grid someplace, and doesn't have to go through a tendering process to identify that. So it is a slightly change in mindset from a tendering process to a regulatory framework that again is part of law. And so it's much harder to change and requires a little bit different thinking, but not a lot. So with that, certainly answer any questions, but I think we'll get into a lot of the questions as we go forwards in some of the more detailed dialogue during today's workshop.
Great, thanks so much, Ian. At this point, I'd like to pause and see if there are any questions on that. I know that was fairly quick, but we just wanted to provide a bit of background on kind of what this process looks like in a similar country. And as Ian mentioned, we'll get into a lot of the details a bit later on. If there are no questions, and for questions, please feel free, I know we've got about 30 folks, which is a fairly large group, and we're happy to see that many, but don't be shy. Please feel free just to go ahead and unmute yourself and chime in if you have questions, or you can just type them directly into the chat box. If there are no thoughts or questions on that immediately, though, we do have our colleagues from Energy Cell join during the middle of that, so I'd like to go ahead and welcome Nicholas and Dr. Calix from Enarse and excuse me, and their team. So Nicholas, I think we'd like to go ahead and hand it over to you at this time to provide any remarks and share a little bit about sort of the current regulatory environment in Haiti. That would be excellent. So Nicholas, over to you. Nicholas, you might be on mute still. Nicholas, are you there? You may be on mute still.
Can you hear me?
Ah, fantastic. Yep, we've got you. Yes, Nicholas, we can hear you.
Sorry, I have a very slow connection today at the office. I don't know if you can hear me. And I apologize to everyone for being late because we had a last minute meeting call with the minister on some internet issues that we could not postpone. And I'm sorry. And thank you for the NREL team to kick off the workshop.
Great, Nicholas. No worries. We can. We got a good start. We can hear you now. So I know we had initially planned to kick off with you sharing a little bit on the sort of current regulatory environment in Haiti. As you saw,
Yes.
we went ahead and mixed it up and started with the Uganda case study instead. But if you'd like to go ahead and jump in, we'd love to hear from you now. Perfect.
Thank you. I know that before I start with the PowerPoint, I know that Dr. Calix from Anansi is also online. I don't know if you want to say a few remarks before I launch the presentation.
Thank you, Nicola. I'm here today to learn, so it's all right. You could go ahead and make your presentation. So I would like just to thank the NREL team for the workshop, because we are deploying microgrids is a big part of what we're doing in Haiti now. We're trying to increase the access to electricity. So microgrid is it's a big part of our strategy. So we are here to learn from other countries, the lesson learned, and to see how to move forward. And I would like to express my gratitude to the World Bank and to the NREL and to the USAID in particular who made this happen. So I'm just here to learn. So I go ahead, Nicola. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Calix. So I don't know if you can see my screen, the PowerPoint already.
Yep, we've got it.
Okay, so my position will be in French. So I think there is interpretation available to translate from English to French, from French to English in this case.
Yes, we have oh, go ahead. I was just going to say we do have an interpreter available to translate from French to English. Thank you, Nicholas.
Perfect, thank you. Donc la présentation va être assez simple, c'est juste pour te donner une idée de ce qu'on a mis en place actuellement pour réglementer les mini-réseaux en l'absence d'un cadre réglementaire qui est établi. Donc on applique ce qu'on appelle les recevoirs contraires. Donc je vais présenter rapidement ce qu'on a mis comme provision plus ou moins principale au niveau de ce contrat de régulation. Et mon collègue Johan Lanancé va présenter certains autres aspects qui ne sont pas directement liés au mini-réseau, mais qui ont un impact sur le mini-réseau, qui sont aussi en train d'être impact à Lanancé. Et donc, pourquoi on s'intéresse au mini-réseau? Parce que le gouvernement haïtien veut promouvoir le mini-réseau, gérer pour le secteur privé, mais l'absence de cadre réglementaire spécifique au mini-réseau crée l'incertitude. Donc, c'est pourquoi on a dû mettre en place des outils pour permettre d'attirer le secteur privé pour mettre en place des mini-réseaux en Haïti. Et on a dû développer pendant les dernières années une convention de concession pour mettre en place des mini-réseaux. Et cette concession facilite la mise en œuvre durable des projets de mini-réseaux par les opérateurs privés. Maintenant, quel modèle qu'on applique pour les mini-réseaux? Bon, nous savons que les mini-réseaux ne vont pas être viables financièrement avec seulement l'apport du secteur privé. C'est pourquoi on a travaillé avec nos partenaires, comme la Banque mondiale au départ, maintenant aussi la BID, pour apporter une subvention et pour connexion. Donc, le modèle, c'est qu'on a le taux qui est au milieu, qui va concevoir, construire, financer et opérer le mini-réseau. Il va chercher les investissements auprès d'investisseurs, comme de dettes, de participation ou même de dons. Et nous, le gouvernement, avec l'appui des partenaires comme la Banque mondiale, on apporte une subvention sous forme de CAPEX pour permettre de réduire l'investissement nécessaire au départ pour les développeurs et au final aussi rendre l'électricité plus abordable pour les clients usagers finaux. Et au final, le développeur va vendre l'électricité aux clients et procurer des revenus.
Clients. So the system is viable. So we can have it in operation for a long duration.
Le plus important, c'est la concession.
The most important is the concession.
Qui est vraiment le contrat principal qui régule le mini-réseau.
The most important, the main contract for the government and for the developers. We have to get a protocol of a contract of agreement, and then private operators. And to take care of precise things from the beginning. That we should establish cooperation with AID. And also to construct, to develop the mini grid. And what you call for the duration of to allow to give service to the client. And then here are the contracts. The aspect is open. The concession is for a duration of 20 years. And that can be renewed for 5 years, every 5 years. The concession.
Et aussi les droits et responsabilités de l'autorité concédante, c'est-à-dire dans ce cas-là, l'NDVTC qui signe la concession. Ça prend en compte, ça gère la question des litiges.
And then also to manage litigations. And then provision to regulate the tariff. And also the right of the developer. And condition that should be reinforced, that should be enforced. Penalty for the contract, after the contracts.
Ça prend des provisions aussi pour l'arrivée du réseau, au cas où à l'avenir, un réseau régional puisse s'étendre.
In case the regional grid. And also there are specific provision for the phases of the construction.
Dans les normes, particulièrement acceptées et reconnues pour s'assurer que ça soit viable, surtout en Haïti où on a des risques.
Especially in Haiti where there are risks.
Donc on s'assure que des normes sont respectées pour que les systèmes soient effectivement construits de façon à durer.
So we want the system to be viable. And then we have specific provision for the payment.
Faire le suivi pour assurer que le paiement est fait régulièrement et faire l'évaluation aussi des connexions au fur et à mesure que le paiement est fait. On a aussi le tarif et la raison du tarif. Donc, comme on a
We also have the tariff.
Direct le tarif. Par exemple, s'il y a un variation de taux de change, qu'est-ce que ça implique pour le tarif?
If there is an exchange rate,
ça définit aussi.
Then the tariff is very important in that case. And also the obligation of the cities.
L'obligation de la municipalité aussi, qui a un rôle à jouer au niveau.
And then they have a role to play. And then the report of furthering. Also for the phase of the operation.
proposé dans son offre.
and the cost of the project.
Maintenant, la licence provisoire qui est fournie par l'ANAC, donc la licence est octroyée par l'ANAC des 30 jours suivant la réception de la notification pour suivant la réception de la notification par les développeurs qui confirme que l'accord est signé.
And then when we grant the license, that confirm the contract
Il n'y a
is
pas de frais à
signed
payer pour avoir la
within
licence
30
provisoire.
days and there's no fraud, and then everything is signed and respected.
Elle est octroyée
The
30
contract is
après la mise en
respected.
service réussie du mini réseau.
30 days after the
Et le développeur.
service,
Et ça donne le droit exclusif d'exploiter le mini réseau.
and I give the exclusive right. And there is a cost for the license.
Normalement des types d'impôts. Maintenant, ce qu'on appelle pour l'exclusivité, c'est sur l'étendue du territoire où le développeur va développer, construire, exploiter.
There is a limit. It's only in the territory, in the country that the development could happen.
Sur le territoire qui est pour le mini réseau. Ça concerne uniquement les branchements à un réseau.
So that concerns only the branches that have to do with the grid.
Le droit foncier et arrangement économique.
For the question of rights of the border,
Il y a des provisions.
there are provisions
Où les réseaux sont développés, si cela est possible, afin de réduire les coûts qui sont associés.
So to reduce the cost,
Des conditions qui satisfait
and also in conditions that are satisfactory.
Soit un partenaire qui nous supporte.
So the Haitian government should be a partner and should support.
Pour convenir de notre passage pour le réseau de distribution, ainsi que l'arrangement économique qui dicte comment la municipalité des terres et d'autres passages.
And also everything should be provided at a reasonable price.
Maintenant, un point qui revient souvent.
One point that they always talk about very often
Et le règlement des litiges.
is the moment of litigation.
C'est le règlement des litiges.
During the litigation.
Maintenant, ce qu'on a comme provision
What do we have as provision as far as litigation is concerned?
où les parties conviennent.
We can always take care of it in a friendly manner.
Maintenant, s'il y a un règlement à l'amiable, on passe à une médiation formelle.
But if it's not possible, we go to a formal mediation.
Soit au niveau national, soit au niveau international.
Or it could be done on a national level or an international level.
Du règlement des différents, qui a un comité qui est mis en place au niveau.
There is a committee that is placed to take care of that. Whenever there is a litigation, or we can go to higher court.
Si les parties ne sont pas satisfaits de la décision du comité de règlement des différents,
if the parties are not satisfied of the decision, they can go to a higher court called La Cour Supérieure des Comptes. That's the specific court in Haiti.
Soulève une difficulté par rapport au fait que les différends au final sont traités dans une cour nationale et qui pense qu'on devrait aller vers un arbitrage international. Malheureusement, la législation haïtienne ne le fait pas jusqu'à présent, mais comme on sait qu'il y a des travaux en cours en Haïti, donc on a proposé de produire un accès rétroactif.
We have a lot of construction in Haiti, so we have a retroactive access.
C'est une mesure qui peut rassurer.
We believe that is a grade that could be reassured to go forward.
Passer la parole à Joanne qui va couvrir.
I'm going to allow Joanne to talk.
Joanne, tu es là?
Joanne, are you here?
Oui, merci Nicolas. Je ne sais pas si tout le monde peut m'entendre.
Thank you, Nicola. I think everybody can hear me.
Est-ce qu'on m'entend? Est-ce que...
Yeah, we can hear you.
OK, parfait. Alors, comme Nicolas l'a dit, bon, je vais juste enchaîner avec une présentation succincte de comment est-ce que l'encadrement
Oui, je
juridique
t'entends.
est fait
Ça passe
en ce qui
dedans, mais je
concerne
t'entends.
la régulation des mini-réseaux.
Are you able to
Donc,
hear me?
donc, dans cette section, il va
Chain of the mini grid.
une première partie où on va parler du cadre juridique actuel et une deuxième partie où on va peut-être vous donner un aperçu de ce qui est en train
The
d'être
second part, we're going to give you an overview of the national level of it.
L'ensemble du cadre juridique haïtien était un cadre juridique monopolistique en faveur de
We talk about
qui était une entreprise publique, qui était l'EDH, qui était
in
à la fois
favor of one business that was a public business
de la commercialisation de l'électricité sur l'ensemble du territoire. Donc, bien
of
entendu,
the
l'électricité d'Haïti
the
comme
commerce
entreprise était
of the
libre
commerce of the whole territory.
avec des entreprises privées au niveau de la
We wanted to do a partnership with a private business
chaîne production, transformation et distribution était sous la responsabilité de l'EDH. Donc, à partir de 2016, le monopole va changer vers un marché qui est ouvert à la concurrence à partir de 3 décrets
to
qui
be changed to a
sont publiés en janvier 2016.
market
Donc, jusqu'à présent, ce sont les
that is
textes
open
qui
to
régissent le
competition
secteur de l'électricité en Haïti.
until
Donc, ces textes-là, donc de manière similaire à l'Ouganda, à partir de ce que j'ai vu, posent un système basé sur la licence, ce qui veut dire que le
We
secteur
have
de l'énergie est ouvert, mais l'ensemble des personnes qui interviennent à la fois sur
the
la
main
production,
texts
sur
that
le
are in the
transport,
internet.
quel que soit le niveau, doivent avoir
The
une
similar
autorisation qui sera émise par l'autorité nationale de
the
régulation du secteur
Uganda
de l'énergie.
the
Donc, il faut voir que les décrets de 2016 proposent une réglementation générale, ce qui veut dire qu'il n'y a pas une réglementation qui rentre spécifiquement qui régit spécifiquement les mini-réseaux.
to be part of the
De manière
there is a general regulation. There are general regulation, not specific regulation for each mini grid.
dans la catégorie de mini-réseaux. Donc, bien entendu, la réglementation générale s'applique aux mini-réseaux, ce qui veut dire que toutes les fois qu'on va avoir la mise sur pied de
The status of the mini grid,
les demandes d'autorisation par
every time we're going to do it, we have to have a request of license, request of authorization.
Donc, ce vide juridique est paré de manière
This legal
le détail concernant la tarification technique, le raccordement
concerning
prévu dans la convention, dans une convention soit de concession ou bien dans une convention directement
they are
avec
being taken care in a convention
le domaine en question, dans le territoire en question.
and
Donc,
in the territory that we're speaking about.
a un avantage, mais cela permet de régler les questions de régulation au cas par cas.
That brings an advantage and that can be taken care of the situation.
Mais au cas par cas, dépendamment de
But it goes case by case.
deux mini-réseaux, les conditions d'intervention, les
We have
conditions de
two
raccordement
mini grids
et aussi les modifications vont être traitées par une licence qui sera
and
spécifique.
also the modifications are going to be taken care of through a license
Donc, d'une manière générale, ce qu'il s'agit de retenir sur la
in a
réglementation
general
c'est
manner. What you have generally what you have to remember
le transport, la distribution et la commercialisation
is the production of transport,
janvier
the
2016 qui régit le secteur
distribution
et quand
that deals that covers the section, the energy section,
c'est une autorité, l'autorité nationale de régulation
and it's one authority, the national authority,
et qui décide de quelles
that
conditions
grants the license and that makes all necessary decisions.
capacité qui a qu'à l'autorité
So-
nationale est aussi définie dans le texte et j'ai seulement
This
relevé
capacity is also defined in the text,
qui nous présente
and number
tous les
3
techniques de
of the
production,
decree,
de distribution
all
et de
the-
commercialisation de l'électricité
all the
ainsi que de prestation de services
technical condition of production, of transport, of distribution, of commercialization of energy
par l'autorité de régulation. Donc, ceci est une présentation de l'ensemble de la photographie juridique de ce qu'on a en vigueur pour l'instant. Maintenant, on a par contre des travaux en cours. Il y a un ensemble de textes sur lesquels il y a encore des travaux qui sont en train d'être faits et on va simplement les mentionner. Donc, on a premièrement sur l'hydroélectricité à petite échelle qui a déjà été rédigé, c'est-à-dire que la phase de rédaction est terminée, mais ce n'est pas un texte qui a été encore adopté. C'est pour ça que c'est toujours au stade de projet. On a un autre projet de texte sur la répression des infractions qui sont liées à l'électricité, qui se propose de régir tout ce qui concerne les infractions
It is not to cover everything that has to do with.
Mais également, ce texte est encore en travaux et il faut que je précise par contre que ces travaux ne visent pas spécifiquement les mini-réseaux, mais
with violation that have to do. This is not only limited to mini grids. This is a way to sanction every type of violation to the regulations.
D'organiser la mise en œuvre de production d'énergie à partir de
to organize the setting, no matter what type of energy. This text is general.
Si on pouvait retenir une phrase peut-être de l'ensemble du cadre juridique qui concerne les mini.
Remember one sentence from the mini
Mais on a
grid.
un cadre général qui s'applique aussi.
We have a general way.
Qui met en place un système basé sur la licence à être délivrée par l'autorité nationale de régulation du secteur de l'énergie.
That the license has to be granted from the government.
Peut-être rajouter.
I believe that Nicola is going to continue.
Thank you, Nicholas and Joanne. Nicholas, was that back to you? Or are we opening up for questions now?
Merci, Nicolas et Joanne. Nicolas, non, je pensais qu'on attendait les questions. OK, merci, Joanne. Les questions.
Okay, great. Are there any questions or comments on any of that? Again, feel free just to go ahead and unmute yourself and chime in or type it in the chat box, either one. Or you can hold them till the end. We should have a few minutes at the end of all of this to discuss as well. Okay, well, if there are no questions.
D'accord, pas de questions. Un grand merci à Nicolas et Joanne. Merci, je vois qu'il y a vraiment
Starting point, a lot of the issues that I think Taylor and Ian will be going through over the next hour or so have already been addressed in one way or another in one place. So it's really encouraging to see, and I think we have a really strong starting point for all of this. So again, if there's no more questions or concerns on any of that, I think that's been some really helpful context. We're now going to shift gears a little bit and dive into some of the key elements that we've seen addressed in regulatory frameworks elsewhere, starting with some of the sort of the institutional processes and considerations for getting started with adopting a new freestanding nationwide framework, which Taylor Curtis from NREL will be presenting, and then moving into some of the specific content items that usually appear in one of these frameworks. So without any further ado, I will hand it over at this time to Taylor, who's going to take us through some of the more institutional considerations when getting started with this. And once again, I'd like to encourage everyone, please do feel free to chime in with questions or comments, either in the chat or just go ahead and unmute yourself when you so feel. So Taylor, please.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Let me try to get my screen shared here. Bear with me, I'm having some difficulties here.
No problem. Also, for those of you looking for translation, the translation should be back on the correct channels now. I know earlier it seemed to be a little mixed up. Hopefully, you were able to find the proper translation on the right on the channels, but it should be all squared away now.
Yes, thank you everyone for your patience as we sort of navigate translating and events and workshops like this in a virtual space. So feel free to chat me if you have any questions or you're not able to hear a translation. Thanks.
Hey, Isabel, it's saying that I don't have sharing or access granted. Here we go.
Are you able, did it show up?
Let's see here. Okay, I think it's working now.
Great, I think.
Are you able to see a screen?
We are viewing your screen. Yeah, we see your entire desktop.
Okay. It never goes to what I'm doing here.
You might just need to pull your PowerPoint into, oh, I see you're doing that. I was gonna say you might need to pull it into the monitor.
I think what you had before, Taylor, was fine. If you go into the screen mode and then up at the top, you can invert screens. You can change the screen to presentation. So once you go into presentation mode.
Are you just seeing the presentation now?
Now we're seeing the presentation. Perfect.
There we go.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Sorry about that. Okay, thank you. So I'm Taylor Curtis. I'm a regulatory and policy analyst at NREL and a licensed attorney in the United States. And today I was
États-Unis, je fais les régulations pour vous ici au niveau du projet. Et là, je vais vous donner les points de vue.
Kind of with a focus on the kind of macro view of institutional processes and decision making, and it was really great to hear the presentation by Energy Cell, because it sounds like Haiti is, as Tim mentioned, is kind of on the right track and asking the right questions, or already answered quite a bit of what we're going to be talking about today. So what is the role of government in the regulation and planning of mini grids? In general, countries choose to kind of pursue a centralized or decentralized or a mixed approach to rural electrification, planning, and regulation. In a centralized approach, the government kind of closely plans and regulates and participates in the expansion of the electricity access. That approach typically for mini-grid development kind of implies a significant role for the government in kind of determining the timing and location for mini-grid projects, and often includes a government role in the development and ownership of assets. And in some cases, they may be developed and owned directly by the government, or a national utility, and in other cases, mini grids may be owned by private developers, but the project development kind of process is closely planned and coordinated with government authorities. In a decentralized approach, the government may have a role in planning and regulating the expansion of electricity access, but the private sector plays kind of a larger role in proposing and implementing electricity projects, kind of under the decentralized approach. One of the government's main roles is kind of to establish market signals that will encourage private sector to kind of pursue electrification efforts. And the government kind of relies on non-government parties to kind of identify and propose potential projects. And of course, that there's an option for kind of like a mixed approach, which it sounds like Haiti may be pursuing. So this table kind of provides an overview of some of the advantages and challenges associated with a centralized approach to mini-grid regulation. You know, some of those advantages, it could lead to kind of more government control over the development process, and kind of allows for the identification and the development of high priority areas for project development, and also allows for the government to have control over the aspects of the development process. And this kind of level of involvement, however, does require kind of a significant kind of financial and human resources, as well as coordination on the part of the government, kind of requiring plans and processes and frameworks to be in place, and at times has proven to kind of stifle private development innovation. Now this table here kind of provides an overview of some of the advantages and challenges to a decentralized approach to mini-grid regulation, kind of currently employed by countries like Uganda. Some advantages could include increased knowledge and perspectives from a larger, diverse industry stakeholder engagement process, which could increase kind of innovation and optimal site development. It can also reduce development costs and risks, since mini-grid developers have more influence over the direction of the projects in this type of approach. And some of those challenges could also include confusion, focused on the kind of lack of coordination, particularly if there's multiple developers interested in pursuing projects in kind of the same area, and just general kind of less control over the site location as a result of this type of approach. So what level of regulation is appropriate to impose on mini-grids after a determination is made on what the role of government is going to be? So there's two kind of primary approaches. There's the light-handed approach, where government regulation is pretty minimal to kind of minimize barriers to the private sector development. And then there's a more comprehensive regulatory structure that where
dans la régulation où on donne on donne un système, on donne un temps bien précis. Il y a aussi la protection des consommateurs, et aussi on donne des informations concernant le coût, l'effectif du service donné. Dans la pratique, vraiment,
is not always clear. Instead, regulators and policymakers might choose a point somewhere in between, or in general, though mini-grid regulation should really try to aim to kind of minimize the additional workload on regulatory staff, and minimize the amount of information a regulatory requires, kind of minimize that workload on the developer as well. In addition to that, some other kind of key focus points could be to kind of use standardized documents or similar documents created by other agencies to make making those available. So for instance, creating an application template to use or other guidance documents, and use applicable rules and decisions made by kind of related government and community bodies when possible. So this chart kind of highlights some and compares some of the key advantages and challenges of these different regulatory schemes. Again, neither view is necessarily the correct one. However, the two main concepts to kind of take home is that, you know, regulation is a means to the end. So what really matters is the ultimate outcome. So an outcome could be sustainable, reliable, and affordable electricity access for households and businesses. And ultimately, you know, the benefits of the regulation should exceed the cost. So if complying with the regulatory requirements leads to excessive cost for mini grid developers, then it's likely to impact mini grid development. So regardless of the level or type of regulation selected, governments typically designate one or more public agencies to oversee the mini grid development. So, and who will regulate that? And to date, many countries have taken kind of a centralized or decentralized approach, kind of opposed to the more regional or localized control regulatory approach. And in a centralized approach, all electricity sector mini grid regulatory responsibilities are designated to a central government agency. And a kind of a decentralized approach, the responsibilities are divided between multiple agencies, and at times there are responsibilities that are also delegated to local governments or public utilities. So for example, a central or national federal agency or agencies like EnergyCell and NRSA may have the regulatory authority to kind of set overarching policy and the preliminary regulatory authority over mini grid projects, including licensing approvals, retail tariff rating, rate setting, enforcement of technical standards, and just generally setting kind of minimal requirements and standards. And some countries have also employed or delegated authority to local and regional government bodies as well, with some kind of like level of regulatory authority to implement siting requirements, codes and standards, and other regulatory requirements specific to their region or locality. To kind of continue our Uganda example, in Uganda, as Ian mentioned, ERA has the primary authority over mini grid projects, but they coordinate with REA, who kind of sets broad rural electrification mandates. One consideration is during the development, the work that USAID has done in Uganda. One of the reports found that many project developers expressed that it was difficult to navigate the mini grid development process in Uganda in certain instances. Many noted that it was not always clear when it was necessary to engage with ERA or REA or both during various stages in that development process. So it's something to consider when setting up a framework. So in either a centralized or decentralized or regional approach to regulation, national government agencies are often tasked with kind of facilitating the development and the responsibility of issuing and monitoring electricity sector regulations on kind of permitting and licensing, retail tariffs and rate structures, technical standards and safety standards, as I mentioned, in addition to kind of citing priority areas for development. Regulators may also kind of facilitate mini-grid development by providing technical assistance and guidance and support for complying with mini-grid regulations. And this can include a number of different mechanisms, and such as funding, kind of coordination, playing a coordination role between different government agencies where there may be kind of non-electricity sector regulatory approvals that also need to be, the developer might also need to get before approval. In addition to some kind of guidance documents on what the, say the licensing process might look like, or checklists for compliance with codes and standards. And as I mentioned before, kind of templates for applications and other submissions that need to go to the government or other regulatory bodies, in addition to kind of model terms and conditions. So some legal considerations for a regulator to kind of effectively regulate mini-grid development is kind of starting with to make sure that there is kind of an appropriate legislation or law in place to ensure that the legal and institutional frameworks are in place before implementing regulation, or that they can implement regulations. In addition to that, other considerations could include kind of ensuring that the regulatory agency's kind of labeling legislation or law grants the agency with the kind of proper authority to regulate mini-grids, to kind of build teeth into the regulation for effective effective policy to regulate the construction, development, operation of mini-grids. So for instance, to ensure that there is an authority to kind of propose procedural and substantive rules, as well as to kind of modify and amend existing rules and regulations, and to build some teeth into those by being able to mandate specific requirements that can impose kind of civil and criminal liability for noncompliance. In addition to that, just looking to ensure that the legislation and law or the regulation itself has some kind of administrative procedure and regulatory control oversight that governs the process by which kind of agencies develop and issue new regulation, as well as the process for kind of modifying and amending or repealing existing regulation, and that ensures kind of consumer and citizen protections. So as the primary function of kind of a regulatory agency is to draft and implement regulation or mandatory requirements for developers and operators of mini-grids, it's important to ensure that certain processes exist and that certain factors are considered to allow kind of effective regulatory oversight. So in that, is there a process, and it sounds like there is in Haiti, that a legal process in place that to pass new regulation or modify existing law? Does the regulation include coordination and compliance with other government laws and mandates? So for instance, in the US, typically there's a requirement for the applicant to show evidence of compliance with other applicable federal, state, local laws. For instance, some jurisdictions require kind of a construction stormwater permit for discharges for construction activities that may disturb 1 acre or more as a prerequisite to a facility permitting approval or siting approval. In addition to that, does the regulation kind of include specific requirements for the regulatory agency? So kind of a commitment to external evaluation and a review of the approval process, in addition to kind of a process for review of existing regulation and creating a cadence for review and revision if applicable. So the last concept I want to talk about today is kind of considerations for drafting regulation for mini grid development.
Comment on va écrire vraiment les lois, c'est juste un draft pour le temps de travail. Ce que ça considère vraiment, c'est une application en détail sur le processus qui est vraiment détaillé, qui est bien défini et quoi ce qu'il.
So if a developer must obtain a license, is that based on a specific capacity factor or a technology factor? And then it's really important to kind of define those key terms and what they mean. And in addition to that, some other factors to consider are kind of what those applications requirements are and what the submission timelines are, and are they clear and easy to find, right? Are they clearly defined and easy to find? And is each step of the approval process defined with timelines? So for instance, if there is a licensing or permitting process, is it outlined sequentially and to include, for example, pre-filing approvals or requirements? So with my, for say, other kind of non-electricity sector approvals, is there pre-filing meetings that are required? Is there a requirement to engage with the public or other industry stakeholders? What are the application requirements? What is the process for filing the application or the review of the application for completeness? What is the process if the agency receives an application that is incomplete? Is that an automatic denial? Is there an iteration process that happens with the developer and the regulatory agency? Is there a public comment process during this? Is there outlined how someone can kind of appeal administrative decision? There are a lot of different kind of minutia that needs to be defined there. And at that, I was kind of wrap up there, and I'll take any questions now, Tim, or after Ian's presentation, because I think he might kind of get into some of these concepts in a little bit more detail.
Okay, thanks, Taylor. Yeah, so as Taylor mentioned, goal here is to present a bit of the sort of the upfront considerations for a particular government or entity looking to develop and adopt a new regulation. Kind of what is
vraiment et adopter quelles les lois légales et législation pour. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions, vraiment commentaires, s'il vous plaît?
Been fairly quiet so far, so hopefully that just means that we're hitting everything and it's perfectly clear, and not that folks are uninterested. But let us know. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we're really keen to hear from all of you. We have both our government partners as well as a lot of our partners from the donor and development community on the line as well. So you know, if there are pieces here that we're missing, you know, key questions that maybe we haven't brought up or raised yet, or some of these questions that are already really clearly well understood and have been well addressed, we're keen to hear from you. So we did get looks like we did just get a question here from Nicholas. What generally guided the decision between the two types of regulations? So Taylor, I don't know if you want to touch on that maybe a little bit, kind of what are the guiding principles behind deciding between those two different overarching styles of regulation?
in terms of more like centralized versus decentralized approaches, or giving kind of regulatory authority to regional or local governments?
Yep.
Yes. That's a great question. I think that there is a lot of factors that are involved in that. I think that
Qui sont dans ça.
has a lot to do with kind of
Ça a rapport vraiment.
the makeup of the government as a whole, and what some of those overarching kind of frameworks are, in addition to the kind of regional and geographic kind of layout of a country too. I think takes might employ, if you have more, so for instance, if decentralized kind of communities that have kind of government structures in place, it may make sense to at least include them in that kind of decision-making process, whether they are delegated authority or not, but they're kind of the boots on the ground that could have maybe a better understanding of what some of the sites might look like for development, and some kind of like other kind of codes and standards, regional or local kind of landscape to employ there. So I think there's a number of different factors that kind of could play into that. And Ian, you might be able to kind of talk a little bit more about your experience in Uganda and what led to their decision making as well.
Yeah, I think two things that I would just add is one, a lot of it depends on the kind of the structure from the government,
Yep.
what laws are passed, and I mean, as an example, in the Uganda context, ERA was told that it had to do this, and therefore they did not have a choice. And so there were a lot of kind of dialogues that we had about how distributed could we make the regulatory, and what kind of allowances could we make for developers. And one of the responses from ERA quite frequently was, the law says we have to do this, and so we can't cede responsibility to the Rural Energy Association because the law says we can't, and therefore that we have to do this, and so we won't do that. And so part of it is that. I think another big element is the kind of level of understanding of these issues within kind of within the larger community. So certainly when you're starting up a new technology like we are here, there's not very many people in local communities or kind of local government that understand them from a technical perspective. And so it's really hard to kind of push the regulatory framework onto people who don't understand the technology. Now, clearly, as time goes on, people understand that more, and you have the ability to push that out. An example, kind of in more general parlance, might be electrical wiring for a home, or something of that nature, where right now, clearly local governments have the ability to do electrical inspections, and that's because there are licensed electricians and things of that nature more widely distributed, and that does not have to be held closely by the federal government. Now, if there were no licensed electricians in the country, then you would have to train up that capability at the federal level to be able to do those types of things. So I think it does change over time as we go forwards.
Great, thanks both. I think that's helpful. I'd also, I know and I see that we have quite a few colleagues from the World Bank, IADB, IFC, and elsewhere. So please don't be shy to jump in and share some of your insights on that as well, if you'd like. I guess at this point, if there are no more questions or comments, and again, we'll have a little bit of time at the end to kind of discuss everything we've gone over. I know we've been going for quite a while. We've got one more sort of set of presentations. I'm going to hand it back to Ian, who's going to now dive a little bit deeper into sort of the specifics of what actually would go into a regulatory framework in terms of content and some of the key issues addressed there. There will be, as mentioned, we're keen to get feedback from all of you. So as Ian's going through this, we're going to have a series of polls, basically as he's presenting sort of each key element. And we'll ask you just to kind of rank real quickly.
Donc, Yves pourra nous donner, s'il vous plaît, jusqu'à 3.
That particular question or consideration of high priority for some additional, A, for some additional training, and then B, to be incorporated into a framework and really should be a priority for Haiti. So yeah, hand it back over to Ian.
Great, thanks, Tim. And just again, we'll pause for a second on the first poll, but the idea here is just a shot from the hip. So as kind of I'm talking through this, how big a deal is this? Is this something that all of you, from your own experiences, knowing that we have kind of a pretty broad group here, from your own experiences, this is something that maybe it doesn't keep you awake at night, but you certainly in your context is something that is more concerning than less concerning as we go forwards. So I'm going to talk kind of going through a bunch of these things that we introduced really quickly with a little bit more detail. Do want to state again that a lot of this work is built out of great work that's done by collaborators here at Cadmus and then TTA. So again, it's fabulous that TTA has been engaged in Haiti for a number of years because they bring a wealth of experience, and that shows with the solicitations in the Ferris program, which is great. So just kind of building a little bit on what Perla was talking about. Generally speaking, you have to have a flexible approach. So everybody says they want a light-handed regulatory approach. No one goes into this saying, our goal is to put all the regulations in and crush the industry. It's never the goal, okay? But especially for a nascent and evolving market, we do need to put in a regulatory framework so that we don't hurt people, which is a primary role of government, but then also so we don't end up flooding the market with bad actors. And I mean, that's the whole reason that you have technical standards. All of the reputable business people, you don't have to worry about. They're going to do the right thing because they know it's the right thing. It's the people who aren't quite sure they want to do the right thing that regulatory frameworks are really designed to protect against. And so even if all of us would want to have a light-handed approach, we always have to keep in the back of our mind, we're not doing this to protect ourselves and our companies, the kind of the star companies from the five-star companies from doing it right. We're protecting the whole industry from the one-star companies that could hurt the whole industry and could hurt people, most importantly. And clearly that's one of the primary roles of government is to make sure that whatever we do, we don't hurt people. And so we have to kind of keep that in mind. Now, we want clear and straightforward guidance. Nothing kills an industry more than unclear and confusing processes to do anything. So we need to minimize the barriers and the cost for mini-grid developers so that they can make the investments that we want to make. Again, understanding that within a regulatory framework, we need to put in enough guardrails to make sure that that we're protecting the industry and the people from those bad actors. We really want to mitigate uncertainty, and that was, as I mentioned at the beginning, that was one of the key problems within the Uganda context. A huge market potential that people addressed. There were mini grid companies that were interested in the Uganda market and were active in the space. But because of the uncertainty in regards to what happens when the grid arrives, we don't trust the utilities to not build the power line to my community for their own reasons or political reasons. What happens when I need a tariff update and it takes 2 years to do the tariff, or I'm handed a tariff that doesn't make any sense regardless of what information I put in. We really have to mitigate the uncertainty, and that doesn't mean we have to make it really easy for them. It doesn't mean we have to give them everything. But if the process is clear, and hearing Nicholas talk about the kind of force of law behind them, knowing that there is recourse if there are problems, then that gives the industry uncertainty, and not necessarily the developers that certainty, but the investors who are backing the developers that certainty. So you can have a small company, but if they can't get money to deploy mini grids because their investors don't see a clear regulatory framework in Haiti, they won't invest in it. And then even if the developer has all the desire and drive in the world to make it happen, they don't have money, it's not going to go anywhere. So you have to be thinking about how do we eliminate the uncertainty for both the local developers, but also their investors. Clearly, we need to build off existing grid codes and compliance with key laws and all of that. Incorporate best practices and lessons learned from other jurisdictions. We're talking a lot about Uganda here, but that's just one case. Myanmar has other really good new code. And so just understanding that. And then last but not least, just want to make it really clear that the 2018 RFP and the FAIRS have done a lot of this key work. And as I said in the beginning, the next step is to take it from an RFP type process into a regulatory framework that allows the market to expand greatly, depending on how the government wants to move those forward. So with those as kind of introductions, did want to kind of break down the discussions mainly in around a series of kind of key concerns and then some key questions. And then over that is laid, to the best of our knowledge, at least at this point, what is included in the 2018 RFP and the current FAIRS program that really addresses these issues that we can build on. And then again, we have the poll there to kind of gauge engagement or level of importance in each one of these kind of conditions as we go forwards. And certainly happy to take questions or comments, both in the chat or just people asking questions as we go through this on these specific topics. So again, we'll walk through kind of the regulatory challenges, technical considerations, tariff, interconnection, and then the kind of records and reporting sections. So terms and considerations. Now there is always confusion about kind of where the regulatory frameworks applies. And in a lot of cases, we don't have clear terms in legal statute about what a mini grid is, what an isolated power system is, what a microgrid is, and really trying to define what those conditions are. Should there be kind of defined conditions for existing licenses? So if under one round, again, the 2018 RFP is a great example. That's an RFP process, and the companies have been identified, they've gone through it, they've met all the requirements, and now we put in a new regulatory framework that requires a certification or something. What happens to all of the people that went through the RFP process? Do they have to now apply for a new certificate? Or if the government updates a regulatory framework, is everybody grandfathered in, or do they have to apply for a new regulatory permit, or do they have to upgrade their systems to meet a new standard? How does all of that work as the regulatory framework evolves as we go forwards? Here's a quick question. So if everybody just as you're going through this, as you hear me talk, just click on the ones that you think. We'll keep it open for about 1.5 minutes or something of that nature. And then we'll move on to the next slide. So to what degree does the distribution system, is that incorporated both in the costing of the projects, but then also within the regulatory framework from a code and grid and standpoint? Or is the distribution system considered independently of the regulatory framework? Another one, are there national priorities that should be incorporated in the regulation, or do we want to keep this relatively free and open? So in the RFP, again, that's an RFP, so it's a different process. There is a requirement for 50% renewable contribution from a generation standpoint. If we're putting in a regulatory framework, does the government want to and need to include similar types of things, or is that more of a kind of a direction from the government, where maybe you put in a regulatory framework that allows every type of micro mini grid technology, diesel, biogas, you name it. But then you have subsidies that are applied for companies that do a higher renewable contribution. So what again, understanding that in the regulatory framework, we're codifying this in law, and how many of these kind of national priorities do we want to include within the regulatory framework? And then what other specific laws provide the legal framework for the requirements? Environmental review, things of that nature that have to be taken into consideration. Another clear example that we're talking about going forwards is kind of end-of-life considerations, recycling components, things of that nature. So give folks a quick second, again, a shot from the hip about the kind of the levels of concern or the depth that we need to go to in these specific areas. Site security and the duration of the registration. So Nicholas talked about a 20-year kind of set aside for the for specific projects, but it takes a lot of time to develop projects, and we certainly don't want, well, not that we don't want, but it's a question of how much competition do you want with developer companies going into a community and investing their money to do the very expensive site surveys, community engagement studies, resource assessments, to be able to get to the point where they can submit a proposal and therefore kind of lock up a particular community that they plan to develop. On the flip side, we've certainly seen it other places where you put up a kind of an open a field for communities, and a company will come in and apply for 100 communities, knowing that they're not going to develop any of them.
Et ils savent que vraiment qu'ils ne vont jamais développer ces projets.
To other people who want to pay for them. And so how do we balance this kind of pre-approval process so that the developers can invest their time and energy in all of the development work to get to the point where they can submit a pre-approval or a submission for a regulatory process. How long, if you do a pre-approval, how long should that pre-approval last? Do you have a year to be able to develop enough information about the site to get the tariffs right and all of that kind of stuff? Is it 6 months? How long should that be extended if a company runs into problems? Haiti has seen way too many of these, and so if there's force majeure or just complications in the market space, how do they demonstrate that they're still actively engaged in the community before you hand that, kind of void that pre-approval regulatory process to another company? Grid extension is another one, and I used the example in Uganda where the government went through and developed a map that said, if you propose in these regions, the grid is not going to come, or at least we don't believe the grid is going to come. So propose in these regions and don't propose in those regions. So what kind of clearinghouse of that nature do we have? Nicholas talked about a 20-year exclusivity. Is that the right number? Should it be less? How can it be extended? And kind of considerations of that. To address changes in standards and policy and conditions, should these be applied to new licenses or retroactively applied to old licenses? How can the service story of a mini grid be expanded without the need of a new permit? So I put in my mini grid in community X, and I'm providing power there for a year, and then the people in community Y that's right next door say, hey, can you provide power over here? And it's easier to extend the line into that new community. And maybe that new community is 3 or 4 houses. Do you need a whole new regulatory process? Do you need a new permit to be able to do that? Or is there some kind of growth ability within the microgrid in regards to your license that allows you to grow your microgrid into adjoining communities? And what is the process of doing that? Are there specific business models or corporate requirements? Do you have to be incorporated in Haiti? Do you have to have local presence? A bunch of those kind of issues, local content, to be able to understand or to be part of this regulatory process. A few seconds here to talk a little, or to gauge how high a priority this is. This whole question about expansion of the grid, of your microgrid, is a huge one that we had to deal with in the Uganda context. And how do you allow the natural growth of a microgrid, which you want to promote? You want to promote the microgrid growth because you made the investment for the capital investment in the first community. And if they can continue to plug in new houses at a cost-effective rate, you want to be able to facilitate that without putting in artificial regulatory hurdles in that development growth profile. So the size limits of the assets, and how do you address, are there thresholds? The Tanzanian example where anything below 100 kilowatts, we don't need the details. You just tell us your name and the community you're powering, and that's all we care about. You do whatever you want, whatever power, we don't care the quality, we don't care, because the goal is providing some level of energy service into that community. And if it's 2 hours a day, then that's better than nothing. And so how do you kind of gauge that? And are we interested in doing that? Not necessarily the 100 kilowatt, that's just a number they came up with, but we could do it with 5 kilowatts, we could do it with 10 kilowatts, but is there kind of this threshold that we should be considering? If a company owns multiple systems, let's say we don't worry about a company that owns a couple of 20 kilowatt systems, but what happens if one company comes in and installs 1,000 systems? When do they become a utility in the classic sense? And clearly we want to make sure that if a company is a utility that has 10,000 customers or 100,000 customers, should they be still considered within the framework of a small mini grid that is still designed? I mean, you have one company that has 50,000 customers and one company that has 300, and is it okay to treat them with the same regulatory brush, or are there kind of thresholds that we need to be able to look at companies differently? What defines size? That in itself is a critical thing. Is it power output? Is it the rating of the distribution network? Is it the total output of the power system? Is it all of the rated capacity of the generating devices added up? So what defines size? And then what happens if a system is upgraded? We have this 100 kilowatt kind of regulatory limit. And what happens if you need to install a new diesel engine or new renewables, more solar, because the load is growing and you've gone over that 100 kilowatt limit? What do you do? Do you have to go back to the beginning of a regulatory process, or is there kind of some streamlined approach to allow you to grow the system to meet the needs of your customers, but without putting in kind of artificial regulatory hurdles in the development process, unless it makes sense, or when it does make sense? Just again, a shot from the hip. How important are the things that we're talking about here? How much bundling of projects should be allowed, and under what conditions? So Certainly under the Ferris, bundling is allowed, but are there kind of requirements around that that we need to be considered if a company is proposing a PV battery diesel system along the north coast of Haiti, and then says, well, I want to put in a wind hydrogen system on the south coast of Haiti. Here's my single permit. I want these bundled. The projects are completely different. The technologies are completely different. The outcomes are completely different. Is that a bundled project? Should it be a bundled project? Should someone be allowed to do that? Or are there kind of constraints we want to put around this as we start going to a regulatory framework as compared to an RFP framework that says technologies need to be similar? So the regulator can hand the project to an engineer that says, okay, all of these are solar battery diesel systems or solar battery wind systems. They're all on the North Coast. They're all of a similar size. Yes, you can treat all of these the same. And clearly they're, in the case of the MOU, you need to engage with each community. You need to have the right legal constraints. But they're all similar enough that we can treat them as one larger project as compared to many different distinct projects. Clearly, economies of scale are really important in the microgrid space because we're not talking about many customers. So you want to be able to balance the ideas of bundling, but not allowing people to bundle things that are completely different that actually slow down the regulatory process as compared to include them. And then are there specific kind of geographic boundaries, legal boundaries, that need to be considered as we look to a regulatory process? And then is the size of the bundle, can I put in 1,000 systems if I think they're all the same? Or do we want to put in some sort of limits, 10, 20? Again, you want economies of scale, and you don't want to put in kind of regulatory problems or put regulatory roadblocks in, but you also want to be careful of the bad actors, again, that might come in and try to do things that are not necessarily in the best interest of the consumers of Haiti. Getting into technical requirements, again, there are fairly good codes that are out there with EDH and the grid requirements, and then also the 2018 RFP calls out IEC and UL for key components. This is all a good starting point that we can kind of work to include in a certification, a registration process. Understanding that some of these things change over time, and we do need to be conscious about this. Are there specific metering requirements, the use of smart meters in those, calibration of those metering technologies? How do we want to worry about internal connections to homes, the use of ready boards and things of that nature? Again, the regulatory requirements for the mini grid should keep people safe, but not necessarily limit innovation and development within the industry, especially because this one is rapidly evolving as we go forwards. And then I think a key one that we can get to is ensure that technical compatibility when the grid arrives. So in the case of Tanzania, they weren't worried about grid arrival too much. And so because the grid wasn't expanding. And so if people wanted to put in DC power systems and use, I mean, I don't want to call them substandard, but not necessarily lower cost distribution networks, and in some cases DC distribution networks, that was fine because you were providing basic energy services to rural communities that didn't have energy service, and they didn't expect the grid to arrive anytime in the future. And so what balance do we want to maintain about the additional cost of requiring distribution networks to be grid ready? So if the grid does arrive, understanding that it might be 10 years before the grid arrives, if not longer. And if we're doing these concessions, it could be 20 years before the grid arrives. And so do we want to invest the extra money to force a distribution network that is of the utmost quality, again, not sacrificing safety and things of that nature, for an activity that if the grid arrives in 20 years, you're probably going to want to replace much of the distribution system anyway. So how do we balance this question of grid compatibility as we look to put into regulatory frameworks for isolated power systems? Quality of service, availability, customer management. Again, the Tanzania example is a good one. If in the case of Tanzania, 2 hours of light is better than no light, or two hours of cell phone charging and radio is better than nothing, and it allows you to charge your lantern that you use during the rest of the day, that is a better service than candles. And so what type of quality do we want to mandate as we go through this process, understanding that the tighter the constraints, whether it's tier 5 or tier 3, tier 3 I think was what was in the 2018 from the World Bank. The higher the tier, the higher the cost, and that means the higher the investment need and the fewer the systems that are deployed, and therefore either the longer it takes to get everybody electrified, or the higher the cost it is to get everybody electrified. And so what is the value? What is the role, or not the role, but the desire of the government specifically into providing energy services, safe energy services to isolated communities? So what are these technical frameworks? How should the technical frameworks be validated over the life of the project? So do you want, we'll talk about reporting in a second, but do you need measurement data for power quality? How are you assessing it's a tier 3 service?
Pour déterminer le service, c'est quoi et le temps que vous allez nous allouer pour ça? Donc, il y a tout ça à considérer. Donc, ça, c'est le RFP maintenant.
Tariff calculation is another huge question. One of the, driving questions, as we all know. Again, there's a good kind of proposed process that's out there, which is great. Haiti is starting off in a much better position than many other companies. The kind of the direct feedback loop in Uganda, it is a feedback loop system that to be able to get a pre-approval for a site selection, you need to have a letter of support from the community saying, this is a tariff that I'm willing to accept. And so there's a whole kind of initial tariff development process that happens before the company can even come to the regulator to say, I want to put in a project here, because they need to get buy-in from the community, and the community has to sign an agreement saying that if the tariff is X, we're willing to pay that. And then you go through a more formal tariff process with the regulator to put in your costs and all of that to make sure that you're not charging too high a tariff. How flexible can the tariff approaches be? And again, the FAIRS program is great in regards to kind of opening it up and not just looking at a kilowatt hour cost per kilowatt hour, but block tariffs and all of those kind of things. But the sky's the limit on what kind of things could happen. I mean, people are talking about blockchain tariff construction, where people bid on tariffs every half second, and it's all done on the computer. And you want to make sure that the structure that you develop doesn't necessarily limit, but does put some sort of controls on the mechanisms as we go forward, and remain flexible, but yet protect the consumer and protect the developer so that they know their revenue stream as they go forwards. How is the process for reassessment applied? Again, the RFP provided a really good kind of, this is a process to update your tariff. It can happen every year. You can do a ratcheting of tariffs based on taxes and discount rates and things of that nature, so that you don't even have to go back to apply if you're within these kind of pretty clear guidelines, and those ratcheting can go up. And then what is the process for a community to get back and claim, or not claim, but raise issues if the tariff is not appropriate in their view. Interconnection of the primary grid, a huge uncertainty in almost every place you go. How long is the site exclusivity? Nicholas was talking about 20 years. Is that the right number? What are the options available to the owner if the grid does arrive? Because we know the grids don't operate, the grid development doesn't operate as
Est-ce que maintenant le réseau est correct? Si le réseau ne fonctionne pas comme on le veut, c'est quoi l'option vraiment du développeur? Est-ce que le développeur lui-même a d'autres options? Qu'est-ce qu'il peut faire? En Ouganda eux-mêmes, on a vraiment regardé le programme qu'ils ont mis sur place. On n'a même pas besoin de rentrer dans les détails, mais ce sont ces réflexions qu'ils ont faites et les discussions qu'ils ont eues. Donc, c'était vraiment, les choix étaient vraiment clairs et simples. Mais le but vraiment, c'est de ne pas avoir de problèmes légaux, parce que dès qu'on a des problèmes légaux, ça va coûter plus cher. Et donc,
in the regulatory space that we have to get into a process of litigation. And so, as Nicholas was talking about, we want to make sure that litigation is an option, that is a path, but we want to do everything we can to make sure that we don't get into a litigative state, because that, to a degree, is a breakdown of the system, not a success of the system if everything goes to litigation when we get to kind of the key problems, like what happens when the grid arrives. And then there's the whole issue around compensation when the grid does arrive. So you can have a very clear regulatory framework around what happens when the grid arrives, but if there is no way to get that compensation when the grid does arrive and you decide to be a power purchaser, but you can't get any money from the distribution company because they don't have any money and they're not going to pay you. So how do we calculate compensation that everybody agrees to? Who provides that compensation, and how is that compensation guaranteed? One of the things that they were talking about in Uganda was just the implementation of an insurance fund. So getting a donor or someone to put in $20 million into a fund that will address compensation for grid arrival, knowing that in all likelihood, no one will ever use that money, or it might be 10 years before someone uses that money. But the fact that there is a fund there so that a developer doesn't have to say, okay, I'm going to put in this grid and there's a compensation scheme, but I have to trust that the government is going to pay when I request that check, and has no confidence that the government will actually pay in the Uganda context. So can we put in an insurance scheme of some sort so that everybody knows that there is money sitting in a bank account there that will pay for this compensation when the time comes, knowing that in all likelihood, very few people will have to worry about it. But it gets back to that. You need certainty from a developer standpoint, and more importantly, from the investor of the developer to know that there is recourse. And then the reporting framework, last but not least, as we kind of wrap up here. Now, reporting performance costs money. Everybody knows that. And the higher the reporting, the higher the cost. The more specific the reporting is, the higher the cost. Our goal here is to provide cost-effective energy services in a safe way to communities, to consumers. And so we need to be able to balance this need to provide money, or need to provide reporting so that we can address the issues around bad actors, that we're providing the power that we need that, and are contractually required to provide, without having too much requirements that raises the cost of the system too high. And so it's clearly a balance of how you do this. If we're specifying a tier 3 or a tier 4 service, how are we ensuring that the consumer is getting that tier 3 or tier 4 service as is required under the regulation? How frequently does that reporting need? How much detail does need to be there? What is the type of process for that reporting? Is it a paper form that people send in quarterly? In Alaska, as an example, we think of the United States as being this kind of highly automated. In Alaska, they still send in a monthly paper form that's faxed into the regulator in the state of Alaska that says, I have this remote power system, and this is how much power I generated, and this is how many consumers I have, and they send it in every month. So is that what we want to do? Do we want to go into online reporting, which requires a level of technical effort? Do we want data reporting? A lot of the systems that are being put in use smart meters, and so it could very well be possible that the smart meters can collect the data and send it to a computer, and the computer can process it and send that data to the regulator, and no human needs to touch it. But that requires a certain level of requirement in regards to the technology that the developers are applying, and that has a cost implication. So how do we think about this reporting framework to maximize the information that we need while minimizing the cost to the developer, both from a equipment, but then a time perspective, which again lowers the cost to the consumer. So that's just a quick overview, and I know I have glossed over many of the issues. Again, thankfully, with the engagement of the World Bank and TTA and other organizations in support of Energy Cell for the 2018 RFP and the FAIRS program, a lot of these issues have been considered on some level. And so I think a lot of this kind of translation into a regulatory framework is good dialogue around the issues that have been proposed or the solutions.
On va faire face et pour trouver des solutions pendant qu'on va réfléchir.
An RFP-based process to a regulatory structure that could allow developers to kind of implement wherever and whenever it makes sense to be able to do that in collaboration with enough stakeholder engagement so that all of the critical stakeholders in the dialogue have a chance to weigh in and provide really great insight. That was certainly the case in Uganda. We certainly came in with one view, but getting all the feedback from the utilities, the developers, the NGOs, the donor organizations, the technical organizations, ended up giving a much better final result that we think will help expand the deployment of mini-grid power systems in the Uganda context, which will again lead to what we're all trying to do, which is provide cost-effective and safe energy services to the people of Haiti. So thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to take questions or to just open dialogue about any of the kind of concepts that were introduced here.
Hi, Stuart here from OGEF, which is a fund which is supporting grids and solar in Haiti. So just interested if you've ever had to deal with that mixture of mini grids and standalone systems. I think, as you said, often a standalone system may be the best way to provide basic lighting and phone charging, but somebody needs a path to, if they then buy some more appliances, they need a path onto the grid. So in terms of regulation, have you seen any requirements that a grid can start with something smaller, maybe some isolated system, but then give a transition up to full grid connection when that is warranted or can be provided at economic price?
Yeah.
So just wondering your feeling on.
Yeah. So kind of in the countries that we looked at, and so
les
that,
pays qu'on a analysés, je demande aux autres d'intervenir s'ils peuvent. Les pays qu'on a considérés, on a vraiment regardé la distinction entre
individual power systems and the kind of the microgrid regulatory environment, with the kind of belief that that in all of these countries, the solar home system market is very open and very competitive. And so if a consumer wants to put in kind of solar power at their home, and they want to do that over connecting to a local microgrid, they can do that. There's nothing keeping them from doing that. And so they haven't wanted to try and address a kind of commingling of solar home systems and the microgrid markets. Basically with the understanding that, that the microgrid energy services is a higher tier of service than the solar home systems could provide. We thought about that, given that because of the cost and innovation within solar home systems, fairly soon we'll be getting to the point where the kind of the lower tiers of service can be provided either equally from a mini grid or from a solar home system at basically the same cost. But the general feeling is right now we're not there. And so if a microgrid comes into a community, in all likelihood, if the consumer wants a higher level of service, they will connect to the microgrid, not expand their solar home system to allow them to have that same tier of service. So we didn't need to. All of these countries have really active solar home service industries and marketplaces, in addition to a mini grid regulatory framework.
Yeah, I mean, the only comment I'd make on that is there's clearly some distortions. The mini grids typically get a grant based on connections. So many times that grant is sufficient to connect a customer who uses almost no electricity, but the grant pays for it. So what you're doing is, in my view, therefore, it's not good use of donor funding, but the way the grant system works is forcing developers to go down that route.
Yep, I don't disagree at all. That it can certainly have that kind of implication.
This is Dana from the World Bank. Maybe just to build on that, it may be interesting to think if there could be some kind of framework that would allow mini-grid developers to provide services to solar home systems under some conditions.
Allons parler vraiment des systèmes solaires avec ces conditions. Donc, ou bien qu'ils
it's cost effective to connect them, or they will remain without the service. So it's one area that could be interesting to think about in general.
Yeah, no, that is a really good point. And I mean, if it makes sense to put in a regulatory, I mean, to a degree, there's nothing that well, we'd have to kind of design it into the regulatory framework. But if a developer wanted to come in and say, we're going to power a community, and we want exclusivity in that community for 20 years or whatever number we determine, and they want to do it with solar home systems or a combination of solar home systems and mini grid for the high energy users or something of that nature, I don't think there would be any reason why they couldn't do that. And again, it gets to this question of, as we develop a regulatory framework, do we allow that? Do we make the regulatory framework flexible enough to kind of combine mini grids, or even a community that is only, at least for the first 5 years or something, only isolated solar home systems? I don't see any problem with that at all.
I mean, I guess the other question then is whether for the mini grid developer, you need to decide whether there's any obligation to connect, or whether, or what that obligation to connect is, depending how far and how expensive that might be to connect, and balancing that is always an issue.
Certainly, and that is to a degree irrespective of subsidies, because subsidies can change, and you need a regulatory structure that kind of exists, whether there are subsidies from anybody, for that matter.
Okay, this is Xavier Valvé from GTA. just to continue on this very interesting discussion, from the presentation, it seems clear that this regulatory framework evolves from the large grid and looks at it as a large grid that becomes smaller and smaller and not even connected. And in some countries, like you mentioned, in Tanzania, they say there is a certain threshold. Below that threshold, you don't need to follow any regulatory framework, or the regulatory requirements are lighter. But at the same time, I think that what Stuart mentioned is what the market
Vous avez mentionné c'est ce que le marché est en train
is driven by demand and by providing the needs at the lower cost. And of course, in places where this is not affordable, and electric service is one of them, we then introduce public funding or subsidies. Okay, but I think that we have to put the regulatory framework in the perspective of the trend of the market. And I do see definitely that if you have an operator of an electrical service which is off-grid in a remote area or relatively remote area, the model is going to be closer to the model of the solar home systems, even if it's a mini-grid, than the model of a micro-utility, let's call it this way. Because in general, you have to try to combine not only the supply of electricity through a meter, but you have to supply the high efficiency appliances that deliver the value for that electricity, which is relatively high to generate. And this is one of the beauties of the solar kits, that you're in reality not buying a solar panel and a battery. You're buying 3 lights, a phone charger, and a fan that have an embedded generation that runs by itself because you're in a sunny context. So the issue that I want to raise is, maybe we should think that the market may go that way. And even if developers are developing mini-grids, most likely they have to get involved with the indoor wiring of the houses, because there will be most of the time no qualified, certified electricians to do a good job, and it's different. Most likely they'll have to get involved with supplying energy efficiency appliances to support their customers. And with the quick development of DC appliances, maybe very shortly, even if you are connected to the main grid, your appliances will be all DC, whether you supply them with an individual solar kit or whether you are connected to a grid that shares a common battery. So I see a lot of open questions that, like you also mentioned, we have to be careful not to constrain too much the development of the market. But for me, if we need to support with public funding the development of this market, this is our strength, because it's a weakness also, but it's our strength, and we can embed a lot of requirements just on the requirements to get the grants. And this is quicker and more efficient, and it's a one-stop shop than having to go to multiple agencies or fulfill different requirements. But we should not say we are only subsidizing a mini-grid. We have to kind of look at tiers and subsidize different levels of tiers. And if the operator of that, say, concession or that service area thinks that for tier 3 is better to have an individual system, it's more cost effective, this is fine, you know. Maybe at some point that client will go to tier 5 and then you interconnect it. Well, there are things that we have to be very, very careful not to over-regulate, because we might make the market very, very uncomfortable. And even the reality is that you see, like you meant, in some places where subsidized grid extension is arriving, you have clients under that grid extension that cost a lot of money, a lot more money than mini grids in many cases, that do never connect because they have a solar kit. So also the concept of the exclusivity is being challenged. We are working on a project in the Pacific where there is a concession to a utility that is taking private clients to court because they are buying solar home systems, and the utility feels that they have the exclusivity to supply electricity, and even and you know, a vendor cannot go and sell solar home systems to clients that then do not connect. So I just wanted to raise a few issues to steer the discussion, which I think is very comprehensive, and I congratulate your presentation, Ian.
Thank you. And I mean, just in response, I agree completely in that the kind of the development of I'm a geeky engineer, so the development of a regulatory structure is there to provide, to ensure safe power to the consumer, and the subsidy structures and all of those kind of things, where you provide your subsidies and where you don't provide the subsidies, I mean, that's a political question. And I think you're exactly right that we need to be conscious, provide good recommendations about tier 3 service is tier 3 service, and we should be subsidizing tier 3 service, not whether that tier 3 service comes from the grid, a solar home system, or a mini grid. We should be technology agnostic, just so long as all of those technologies are safe and we can ensure that they provide that tier 3 service and to help and protect the consumer. I still think we do need regulatory.
Je pense qu'on aura toujours besoin.
Grid, the solar home system, and the mini grid, the kind of mix in between the two, that need to be cognizant of the value of the other two and not limit or force a decision that doesn't make sense to force.
I'm just curious, Stuart here again, and I would agree entirely in terms of subsidy should be technology agnostic. Have you ever seen that in practice so far? Is there any experience? No?
Of course not.
Okay. So Haiti could be the first.
I mean, yeah, no, I mean, but again, subsidies come from knowledge and political will. So, I mean, it does not surprise me. Governments have been subsidizing the grid forever. Grid extension forever, and they know how to do that, and that's there. So when the solar home market came along, it takes new thinking and new perspective, and organizations like the World Bank have been fabulous in kind of promoting these ideas that there are other technology options, and the subsidies evolve and change, and I think that's a continual process. So the fact that there are a lot of governments that are now looking at subsidizing both solar home systems and mini grids is fabulous, because they're moving away from the more kind of putting the subsidies to provide energy services in the most cost-effective way to do that, and it's an ever-evolving process. But I think we're going in the right direction.
I'm sorry, it's Nicola here. I think it's a very great discussion. But I'm thinking also that there is a need to also address the consumers, because they also need to understand and see what because some people, they just want the grid because they think it's the best solution for them. They don't understand that they can get good service with solar home system or even mini grid. But I think also this is something that need to take into account and developing this regulation, also communicating that to the end user. I don't know if you have provide any example like in Uganda or what they have done in that sense.
I mean, I think Stuart coming in again, there's a big variation of solar home systems. And if anything, they're getting, again, the technology is developing. So at one time, solar home system was a consumer item you sold to the customer, they installed it, and that was it. Now you're getting much more of these, what I would call gray areas, which is more monitored, more service agreements. So you're getting what I would call closer to a utility style service from a solar home system. So there's developing quite a broad range within just solar home systems.
I fully agree. We need to get this word out to the out to end users. But I agree with you, Stuart.
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases we all try to have the end user's voice represented, but I agree with you, Nicholas, that's probably the hardest element of this, and how you provide the education to the consumers so that they can make educated decisions is a very hard thing to do. And certainly what you end up getting is the kind of the educated and the wealthy consumers. They're the ones that can afford the solar home systems and things of that nature. Now, clearly, as Stuart was mentioning, we're getting into much better kind of financial mechanisms that are allowing us to get to more consumers with solar home systems with kind of pay-as-you-go and things of that nature, even in the solar home system market. So it's constantly evolving, but it's a constant educational process, especially for the smallest energy consumers.
Thanks.
Well, I think this has been been some really good discussion, and thanks so much for the feedback from Stuart, Xavier, Nicholas, and others. It's exactly the kind of, I think this is exactly the kind of dialogue that we're hoping to have with all of you going forward as we go through this process. You know, we certainly recognize that this is absolutely not happening in a vacuum, and there's a lot of good work that's already been done, as well as a lot of expertise, not only on this call, but also just in terms of others who are working on this. So just to kind of wrap up real quickly, I just wanted to share a quick rundown of kind of where we are expecting to go from here.
Récapitulation de ce qu'on devrait faire maintenant. Donc voilà les questions.
A lot of answers. And that's what we're hoping to get at over the next 18 months, really, of cooperation with Energyscell, with NARCE, and with everybody else here on the line. So we're putting together a working group consisting of folks from the Energyscell and NARCE, NREL, of course, and then others who are maybe interested and able to participate in this, to actually draft sort of this framework that we've been discussing, hopefully with input from all of you. Through a series of ongoing, remote meetings. Obviously, COVID's limiting our ability to participate in person. Usually we'd have a series of in-person workshops where we could all roll up our sleeves and hammer this out, but we're having to do it virtually. And again, we do recognize that there's a lot that's already been done and a lot of expertise to lend to this. So the goal here is to build on what's already been done, make sure that the framework we are developing really does fit into the context and the existing, meets the existing needs, rather than putting something together really brand new. We're hoping sometime next year to have a couple rounds of public consultation with not only with everybody here, but with bringing in the private sector and others who might have interest in consulting on this regulation. And then the tentative goal, obviously all these timelines are very subject to change, is to have sort of an initial framework that we can launch sometime in the first half of 2022, so about 18 months out. And then of course, in parallel to all of this work to actually build this framework, we will continue to have more targeted trainings on some of the key issues, both regulatory and technical, that have come up. So really diving into each of these individual questions as individual pieces and spending time getting into the details of that. So that's just a high-level view of kind of what's to come. But again, we really appreciate everybody's time in participating today, and we are keen to get continued feedback from all of you. So we'll be sure to share the slides from today's presentation with everybody, and please do not hesitate at all to reach out via email, phone, WhatsApp, what have you. We are keen to make this as inclusive a process as possible with all of our partners across the board. So with that, maybe I'll ask, Nicholas, Dr. Calixte, I don't know if you guys have any closing thoughts or wanted to add anything in closing as we wrap up here.
Anyway, thanks for this great conversation, and I'm looking forward to moving ahead with the regulations, tools that we want to put in place for the microgrids. But we have to admit at the same time that Haiti is a different country than others, so we have to make sure that the regulations that we are putting in place are really into the local context, so that we make sure that they will be applied, they will be applicable. So thanks a lot, and I will pass I think Nicola can go ahead and conclude. Thank you. Anyway, thanks for the time and thanks for this great contribution to the nation.
Thank you, Mr. Calixte. I wanted to thank all the participants. We took the time to attend and give feedback. And I think, like Tim said, we can count on you moving forward to provide feedback again during consultations on what we'll be developing. And I also want to thank the NREL team for putting those together and for supporting us in this great initiative. And I look forward to the output of this. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thanks both, and thanks all. I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. So I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.